Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susanna Kelly, and I serve as the program head of the Mass Atrocities and International Law portfolio at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. I'll be moderating today's conversation. New Lines is a DC-based foreign policy think tank. My work itself focuses on legal and policy research, atrocity prevention, and how the international community responds to mass atrocities. For those of you who aren't familiar with our work, New Lines has been working on Ukraine since the start of the Russian full-scale invasion into Ukraine, with a particular focus to whether or not the war itself is genocidal in nature. This work includes two legal analyses, the first of which found reasonable grounds to believe that Russia engaged in direct and public incitement to commit genocide. The second follow-up report concluded that the Russian Federation had not only continued, but escalated its efforts to commit genocide. Now, as we approach nearly 4 years since the full-scale invasion, the human cost of this war continues to deepen. Released Ukrainian prisoners of war have reported ongoing torture and ill treatment, particularly within detention centers in the Russian Federation, including sexual violence and deaths in custody. 2025 marked the deadliest year for civilians in Ukraine since 2022, which is when the full-scale invasion started. Meanwhile, much of the current media and policy discussions focus on ceasefires, territorial concessions, reparations, while far less attention is being given to two issues that are central to how this war is being fought: widespread conflict-related sexual violence and incitement to genocide. Russian state and media rhetoric repeatedly promote narratives of erasure that denying Ukraine as a nation, denying their existence as a nation and as a people. Yet these narratives are rarely covered in the mainstream media. Likewise absent from the media is the use of CRSV as a weapon of war in Ukraine, which under international law can be a constitutive act of genocide. The use of CRSV, of conflict-related sexual violence, is fundamental to the understanding of the nature and the conduct of this war. Yet it remains underreported and underdiscussed due to stigma, the gendered impacts of these harms, and systemic marginalization. To help ground today's conversation, we'll begin with a brief context-setting presentation from the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, focused on UN-verified data and trends related to conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. We're honored to be joined by Romana Lemishka, Human Rights Officer at the CRSV Unit Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. After that, we'll turn to our panelists, Hoar Habrelian, Dr. Ingvild Odegaard, and Emily Prey. Thank you all for being here today. Romana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to colleagues joining from all over the world. I thought I would probably start this presentation by giving you a brief background about our mission. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission is part of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and our mission has been present in Ukraine since 2014. We are in Ukraine based on the request from the Ukrainian government, and starting from February 2022, we have been focusing on violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Starting from 2014, the mission has been documenting conflict-related sexual violence, but in 2023, with the support of the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict from the CRSV Pramila Patent's office, we established a specialized CRSV unit to bolster these efforts. We document conflict-related sexual violence based on confidential interviews with survivors, witnesses, and other sources. We use the data that we gather in our public reports. We also contribute to the Secretary General's annual report on sexual violence in conflict. Our findings influence the UN decision-making and as well as member states' action, policy-making, including policies and programs for survivors. They are also very often relied upon by international courts in their decisions. And now turning to the main part of my presentation, the documented cases and patterns of sexual violence. Our latest figures were included in the periodic report of our mission, which was published in early December. And in that report, we included the most up-to-date information on the documented cases. And so between February 2022 and the end of November 2025, our mission has documented 742 cases of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. These cases impacted 590 men, 136 women, 14 girls, and 2 boys. We are currently processing more data and more cases, and then the most up-to-date figures will be included in our next periodic report. When we analyze these cases, it's very important to emphasize that the vast majority of cases, to be specific, 663 cases, or 89% of the total number of documented cases, were perpetrated by the Russian Federation authorities. These, when we look at these cases, the forms of sexual violence documented range from rape, gang rape, sexual assault, beatings and application of electric shocks to genitals, to forced nudity, sexual degradation, sexual harassment, threats of sexual violence, including threats of rape, gang rape, or castration. In 2 of the documented cases, women had children as a result of conflict-related rape. When we analyze these cases perpetrated by the Russian Federation authorities, we see 3 patterns of sexual violence. The first one is sexual violence used by Russian Federation authorities against Ukrainian prisoners of war, men and women in the Russian Federation and in the occupied territory. Prisoners of war actually constitute the largest category of survivors in the documented cases. The second pattern of sexual violence is against Ukrainian civilian detainees who are held by the Russian Federation also in the occupied territory or in the Russian Federation. And then the third pattern of sexual violence committed by the Russian Federation authorities is sexual violence against civilians outside of detention settings in residential areas where Russian armed forces are present. And then, by the way of brief analysis of these patterns, it's important to highlight that when we look at the first and second pattern of namely sexual violence against prisoners of war and civilian detainees, we have cases against men and women, but the majority of documented cases are against men. But when we look at the third pattern of sexual violence against civilians in residential areas, the majority of survivors in the documented cases are women and girls. Then if I turn to the cases, documented cases perpetrated by the Ukrainian authorities, we as of the end of November 2025, we had 79 cases perpetrated by the Ukrainian authorities. This number constitutes 11% of the total number of the documented cases. And it's also important to highlight that the range of forms that we see in these cases differs from the forms in the cases perpetrated by the Russian Federation. For example, in many cases perpetrated by the Ukrainian authorities, many of these cases included only threats of sexual violence. Also, we don't have any documented cases of rape by the Ukrainian authorities. And we also don't have any documented cases of sexual violence against children by the Ukrainian authorities. That's briefly about the patterns that we see. By way of concluding, or just to sum up, I wanted to highlight that we are aware that there are multiple barriers to reporting. We do realize that there are many survivors who still haven't shared their experiences with us, and we also are aware that there are some who will never be ready. And we are very grateful to the networks of survivors in Ukraine, both networks of women and men survivors, as well as to civil society organizations, state institutions, UN agencies who are referring survivors to us when they are ready so that we can put their testimonies on public record with the UN and then contribute to furthering the accountability and justice for survivors. That's very briefly from my end on the patterns that we see. I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our findings.
Thank you so much for Romana for presenting those stats and trends. It really sheds a lot of light into the vast majority of how these cases are perpetrated and against whom. And of course, sexual violence against men is less talked about against women. So thank you so much, both for presenting and the work you do in the CRSV unit. For the audience members, if you have any particular questions for Romana, please submit them in the chat. But in the meanwhile, we'll move on to our next panelist, Hoar Habrelian. She is a Ukrainian lawyer who holds a PhD in international law and justice. She's a consultant at Just Rapid Response in Kiev, where she works supporting justice initiatives related to international crimes in Ukraine. Previously, she served as a national lawyer with Global Rights Compliance's sexual and gender-based violence mobile justice teams in Ukraine, and was a visiting professional at the Office of Public Counsel for Victims at the International Criminal Court. Hoar recently published a policy report with New Lines on the long-term impacts of CRSV on Ukrainian civil society and outlines key policy gaps for survivors, law enforcement, and post-war recovery. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you to the New Lines Institute for bringing this discussion together. And thank you, Romana, for your great presentation and the important work UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission is doing in Ukraine. In my presentation today, I will mostly talk about the long-term effects of CRSV in Ukraine and the policy challenges and the gaps we face today. And I will start with my observation that now in Ukraine, we witness kind of a transitioning period from a law drafting phase, I would say, to what can be best described as a implementation crisis phase. When we see that the psychological, medical, legal, and community support for survivors remain insufficiently coordinated. Just recently, I joined one of the discussions with survivors of CRSV, and I want to acknowledge how strong and vocal many of survivors in Ukraine are. And they want to be a part of the policy discussion, and they want to bring forward their valuable insights and grounded insights. I would say that survivors, they are not asking only to be consulted. They really want to be co-creators and of those measures which are created for them. And it is encouraging that some initiatives in Ukraine are already aware about that and actively inviting survivors groups into policy discussions. And this gap between progressive legal framework and lived reality of survivors is exactly why this kind of discussions and about impacts matter so much. Like often when we speak about CRSV and not only in Ukraine, we focus which is understandable. We are focusing on criminal accountability and the immediate harm which survivors suffered. And what is far less visible and far less prioritized are the long-term consequences, which survivors may carry for years. And the social stigma, the economic exclusion, the psychological harm, and the gaps in justice and reparations that persist long after active hostilities move elsewhere. So in my recent New Line report for the New Lines Institute, I tried to look at these long-term impacts, and it's great we are bringing this topic into policy discussion because the way we address CRSV today, I think this will shape Ukraine's post-war recovery and trust in institutions for generations. First, I want to acknowledge something important, that Ukraine began a public discussion and a policy conversation of reparations and supporting mechanism for survivors of CRSV very early, while war is still ongoing. And in November 2024, the Ukrainian parliament approved two laws. One of them is a law on interim reparations for the victims of CRSV. And to my knowledge, Ukraine is the first country in the world to adopt a law on interim reparations for survivors of CRSV during the active phase of the war. And I think it's not a symbolic thing, it's a powerful signal and a political will and a clear recognition that survivors cannot be asked to wait for peace in order to be supported. Of course, significant gaps and practical challenges remain, and implementation is always complex, and resources are stretched, and nothing about this process is easy, especially in a country which is fighting a full-scale invasion. But I want to approach today's discussion with cautious optimism, and to say that Ukraine has made substantial efforts under the extraordinary difficult circumstances, while civilians continue to live daily insecurity and loss, and among those civilians are survivors of CRSV. The fact that these steps toward reparations are being taken now, not postponed after war, this matters a lot. And so one of the central findings of my research is that CRSV is not only a crime of past or present, it is a long-term social, psychological, legal, and economic harm. And if it unaddressed will shape Ukraine's post-war society for decades. We have seen this kind of examples, and Emily, I guess she will talk about that, and she mentioned she did a great work on her report on Bosnia and Herzegovina, lessons learned for Ukraine. But in my report also shows a growing and warning gap between policy architecture and the reality in which victims live. So survivors still face fragmented services, inconsistent investigative practices, and stigma within their communities, and justice process that often rely too heavily on their own participation and their own testimonies, sometimes at the cost of safety and dignity. The other thing is that long-term psychological care remains underfunded, and referral pathways are informal or inaccessible, and the sustainability of specialized prosecutors is increasingly uncertain today due to institutional restructuring in the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. What it means in practice is that legal reforms may advance, and we have seen a lot of great initiatives in Ukraine, but without this careful implementation, survivors may not feel their impact. So I've tried to be mindful of my time and highlight only key challenges and observations. I'm very happy to go deeper into points during the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gore. And for those of you who haven't read her piece, Long-Term Impacts of CRSV, I highly recommend it. You can find it on the New Lines website. It's to the point on what needs to change and what, good progress Ukraine has already made for their survivors, as she already touched on. That leads me to our next panelist, Dr. Ingvild Odegaard. She is a Norwegian political scientist and a professor. She's an expert on children born of war and is the founder of the International Network of Interdisciplinary Research on Children Born of War. She serves as the chairwoman and managing director of the Foundation Children Born of War project, and she also co-authored New Lines' report, Children Born of War, Considerations for Policymakers. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the invitation to talk here today on this very important topic. listening to the two previous speakers, I must say I am definitely not as a Ukrainian expert as you, so I really appreciated the information you shared with us. Highly interesting. I would like to maybe take this as in a little bit broader context on the children born of war, as I do not know how many of the participants are aware of what we're actually talking about when we talk about the children born of war. So if I may, I would just jump a little bit into the much more kind of broader setting, which is also, of course, highly relevant to the Ukrainian case, and lead that back to, well, to the report that I wrote with Emily, but also to the reports, the other reports that we've been working on in the research projects on Ukraine. So, as Susanna said, I have been working on the field of children born of war for now actually more than 20 years. And it's the concept, which is now highly recognized in all the settings, and that we tend to talk so very clearly about, all of us, actually was more or less born 20 years ago in an expert meeting that took place in Cologne, and where we talked about children born of war, but CBO in short, and also decided that it should be defined as including both the enemy occupation rebel and also children of the peacekeeping troops, independent of how these children were conceived. So actually, and I think that is something I would like just to emphasize in this setting, as I have the opportunity to, is that the usage of SIBO, as it's now very often done at looking at children born of rape only, is actually very limited in the whole academic and research discussion from which the whole topic originated. As we've heard also from the previous speakers, and which I think is known to most working in this field, is that in times of conflict, and what we've seen from various of conflict settings, is that in times of conflict, the distinction between consensual and non-consensual is very often blurred. And evidence also from several conflicts indicated that both the women and the children born of war have experienced significant stigmatization and discrimination, independent of the relationship or the way they were conceived, simply because the father, which is very often the case and usually the case, as at least so far, is considered to be a part of an enemy troop, which is one of the things that defines the children born of war in our research. And specifies them to be very different compared to, of course, a lot of groups of children that suffer from war settings. I always want to emphasize this because I tend to get the question, why focus on this particular group? Well, simply because it has been so overlooked for so very, very long. Now, looking at why this is so important is because, and it being born as an enemy has severe consequences for you in the conflict and the post-conflict, and is highly related also to the stigma and the discrimination that these children, but also their mothers, experience in war and post-war settings. And I will come back to many of these topics also later when we get into questions on how this can be encountered by the communities and the societies. So firstly, when I first started working on this topic, the focus was very much related to World War II, to the Vietnam and the Korean War. And the reason was actually quite simple. There was a lot of research projects going on, biographies were published, archival material became accessible, and with the increasing conflicts and civil wars, and also focus on conflict-related sexual violence, also the focus on the children increased, particularly following the war in Bosnia. So when we talk, so basically just to kind of say a little bit about why I dive into getting this into the historical setting, is that although these conflicts from the historical cases are very different, maybe to what we encounter and what we talk about today, this information that was the basis for a lot of the things on which the children born of war research has been based, has been fundamental and important to set up an evidence and knowledge base which we could use also to transfer this information into today's conflict and war settings, such as in the Ukraine, but I'm presently also working with other countries, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and so on. And so even though all cases and all countries and conflicts are of case sensitive and have their own history, have their own cultural settings, I think still it is very important that we realize and that we see and that we use knowledge that we can apply from other wars and settings, which has turned out actually in this work that we've been doing to be highly valuable. So when I set up the platform, the first one that Susanna just mentioned in 2008, it was simply to get a topic on the agenda and share what do we know, independent of what kind of, where does it come from? And I worked with organizations, with medical doctors, with individuals, with researchers from all kinds of disciplines, because there wasn't any kind of united understanding of what we were actually talking about, or what would be the patterns. What is actually the structure here? What do we need to look into? What may be relevant? What may not be relevant? So setting up this and getting that into a format, academic-based, research-based, which could be a starting point for doing further knowledge-based transfer, has actually turned out to be very important. So when we today meet and in all other settings and talk about children born of war or children born of conflict-related sexual violence, it is actually, I think, a very good example of a topic that has managed to reach, as depressing as it is, a public agenda and getting a focus which it didn't have when I first started to work on this. So on the one hand, it's very positive, but on the other hand, what very often happens is that, and as a comparative political scientist, that's another thing I want to emphasize, is that although I said every case is different, there are still ways in which you can much more easily get a grip of differences and similarities if you look at other cases too, because there are actually knowledge transfer possibilities, outreach possibilities, ways of also avoiding very many of the ethical challenges that we have also had in monitoring, in data collection, where we think that we've done good, but where actually the respondents have said that it hasn't been all good what we're doing, which is closely linked to also the challenges addressed by Romana and trying to find proper data which can be used. We need to remember that also the voices of those who are willing to share the information may be highly biased. So when I hear that there are 2 children born of war in a sample of almost 800, I can tell you I know about 5 already, and I haven't talked to almost 800. And that's again something which makes me a little bit aware of, where is it that we are losing out? And we do know that also, particularly in ongoing conflicts where you don't know what the outcome will be, you don't know which side you as a woman may be on, depending on the territory where it's going, is of course a part of the evaluation you do as a woman, as a possible mother for you and your child when you decide to disclose information or not. I will
Thank you so much. Unless you were about to.
I will end with two
Yeah.
points.
Yes.
And that is that as happy as I am about the focus on children born of war in the setting of conflict-related sexual violence, I have seen this transition going from being very only focusing on the women or the mothers and not the children, I always tend to, as a representative of a children born of war organization, we need to accept that or keep the interest of the child also and not lose it, because there are challenges also in integrating the interests of the children and the survivors in the long-term effects of dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, it's very interesting to see and hear about the differences across countries and maybe the differences in research and data that different organizations might find. So thank you, Ingvild, for your important work on all this and for providing the audience members with a brief overview of like what even this means. Your report, Children Born of War: Considerations for Policy Makers, is also available on the New Lines website. I also highly recommend that. And that leads me quite nicely to the final panelist and your co-author on that piece, Emily Prey. Emily Prey is the Director of Mass Atrocities and International Law and Gender Policy Portfolio at New Lines, where she produces research on topics relating to atrocity prevention, the future of international law, and gendered analyses of foreign policy. Emily is advised on major independent expert reports, including the legal analyses of Russian breaches of the Genocide Convention that bring us here today, and she brings deep expertise on gender, CRSV, and genocide. Emily, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you to all of my other panelists. It's always so interesting to hear you speak and to learn from you. And especially thank you to Gore, whose report is the impetus behind this event today. So I highly recommend that everyone go online and check it out if you haven't already. So I'm here speaking because a few years ago, about 3 years ago, I, with my co-authors, Tanya Domi and Kinsey Spears, decided to write a report on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, lessons from Bosnia, which Gore kindly mentioned earlier. So we published it, we began working on it in late 2022, and we published it in 2023, and it was the first of its kind that delved deeply into the use of sexual violence being used by Russian forces in the war, taking lessons learned from the Bosnian genocide and the Bosnian War, and providing actionable policy recommendations for Ukraine and for the wider international community to best support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Our goal was to look at what worked in Bosnia and what didn't, and so that we could strengthen Ukraine's response to sexual violence in the war and more effectively and holistically support survivors. And although we focused on Ukraine, many of the recommendations can be replicated to other conflicts where sexual violence is being perpetrated. So I'll just briefly kind of talk about sexual violence in conflict. It has nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with power. Since the start of Russia's aggression in Ukraine in 2014, there have been countless reports of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians of all ages and all genders. Women especially have faced extensive sexual violence, reporting being gang raped, having their families being forced to watch Russian soldiers raping them, being branded by soldiers, being held as sexual slaves, being raped until they're pregnant. All of these acts are deliberate methods to subjugate survivors and to further break down societal norms and bonds. One important component of rape as a weapon of war is the sense of social cohesion and bonding that rape provides for militaries that are not cohesive or that have used force to recruit their fighters. And the Russian military famously relies heavily on convicts, on conscripts, forced recruitment, foreign fighters from North Korea and elsewhere, and mercenaries who do not have a strong sense of belief in the cause of the invasion. And so these types of groups have a higher likelihood of participating in sexual violence during conflict. And gang rape in particular, it creates bonds of cohesion among soldiers who don't have a shared background or who don't have the same allegiance towards the ongoing war. And that is, I think, one of the big reasons why we're seeing sexual violence being used so frequently by Russian forces in Ukraine. And just very briefly, the report was on lessons from Bosnia. And so some of the lessons that I think that we can learn from Bosnia that still do hold true today, even though we published the report several years ago. The idea of universal jurisdiction is very important. It has been used positively in the case of Bosnia. 30 years after the conclusion of the war, Bosnia indicted a former Bosnian Serb soldier, Slobodan Krčić, in 2018 for the murder of 2 Bosniaks and the rape and sexual abuse of Bosniak women and girls. And in 2022, the higher court in Montenegro confirmed an indictment of Krčić, who had been living in Montenegro at the time. Their universal jurisdiction has been used by many countries already in support of Ukraine, and I would love to see even more countries use it. Children born of wartime rape, obviously, this is something that Ingvild will discuss, but in Bosnia, there's an estimated 2,000 to 4,000 children who were born of wartime sexual violence in the war. And in July 2022, they were granted legal recognition after years of struggle for legal action by the government in the Brčko district. And then a year later, they were granted recognition in the Federation. So something that Ingvild and I have both been working on is wider recognition for children born of war in Ukraine. We know this is happening. We know it's happening in the temporarily occupied territories. It's been happening since 2014. So there's definitely a lot to be done for policymakers on this issue. And then lastly, reparations. In Bosnia, only about 1,000 victims of CRSV received reparations. There's often a limited understanding of what victim reparations mean compared to state reparations. And I very much recommend a survivor-centric view when we look at reparations. And organizations like the Global Survivors Fund are doing really incredible work on reparations for survivors of sexual violence. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you all for your opening remarks. It's really great to hear from people who are actively doing work on this and are actively trying to change things. I think an overall takeaway from the discussion on all parts seems to be that CRSV should be centered when we discuss war, prevention, recovery, and we have to reckon with the long-term impacts of this, including, of course, the enduring impact on survivors as well as children born of war. And as Emily touched on, CRSV isn't a byproduct of war, but under international law, it can be classified as a war crime, crimes against humanity, torture, and of course, in certain contexts, the genocidal act. But on the flip, and the reason we convene this panel today, it's great to hear about some of the progress occurring from the UN and from within Ukraine, how CRSV is being documented on the ground to legislation in Ukraine and funding and national efforts, as well as, of course, identifying concrete plans for continued improvement. With that, I'm going to open it into the Q&A portion. I have some questions prepared, but audience members, if you have any particular questions you would like to submit, please use the chat box. I'll start with a question from you, Romana, and I'd like to hear a little bit maybe on the differences between the way you conduct research and in documenting children born of war and the way Ingvild might have. But what are your biggest challenges that your team faces in documenting these, particularly in the occupied and recently liberated territories?
Thank you very much, Susanna, for this question. Yes, we, as I mentioned towards the end of my presentation, we are aware of multiple barriers to reporting, and just to mention a few of them, of course, survivors might be reluctant to disclose what happened to them because of stigma or because of fear of stigma or because of trauma or because of fears of being further traumatized. Some survivors also told us that they were hesitant about disclosing sexual violence because they still have relatives in the occupied territory, and they fear that if they do disclose sexual violence, then the Russian occupying authorities might find out, and then there might be retaliation against relatives in the occupied territory. So that's also a big factor. Some survivors also told us that they don't necessarily believe that it's possible to find perpetrators or to punish them. So they might have some doubts about the prospects of achieving justice, and then that affects their reluctance to disclose. Some also have concerns about confidentiality. They fear in general that if they open up, then the information about them might appear somewhere in the public, on the public domain, or like people in general might learn about them. Some also told us that they have some mistrust towards law enforcement, for example, that they don't necessarily want to share the stories with law enforcement. So there are multiple barriers that affect the disclosure and affect our work. Additional one, which is very specific to our work as a mission, is that we don't have access, physical access to the occupied territory. That's why, for example, Ukrainian prisoners of war, as well as Ukrainian civilian detainees, they are held either in the occupied territory or in the Russian Federation, and we don't have access to either of those. So we are not able to visit them in those detention facilities and then learn about their experience there. We can only talk to them once they return to the government-controlled territory, and that's such exchanges don't happen very often generally. So that's one. And also, of course, the civilians in the residential areas, as I mentioned, the third pattern that we see, also we don't have access to the occupied territory. We cannot just talk to women and girls and men, boys who live in the occupied territory and ask them about their experiences. We also wait for them to come to the government-controlled territory, and we wait until they are ready to disclose what happened to them. And sometimes it takes time for them until they are ready. And also, I would like to highlight here that there is a big difference between the access that the lack of access to the occupied territory or to the Russian Federation on the one side. On the other hand, we do have access to all official facilities where Ukraine keeps Russian POWs or conflict-related detainees. So we do have access to them here in Ukraine. Ukraine grants us unimpeded access, while we don't have such access to the Russian Federation. So multiple barriers. We are aware of them. That's why we are extremely grateful to all partners who are helping us who are referring survivors to us, including the Global Survivors Fund that Emily mentioned. They are administering the pilot project on interim reparations here in Ukraine, and they have been referring survivors to us so that we can document their cases and include them in the public UN records, as well as other actors, sister UN agencies, Ukrainian national institutions, other CSOs. We can, based on those referrals, we can verify cases using our methodology, and we are very grateful for all those partners who help us with that.
Thank you so much for the very thorough response on all of that, and again, for the work you do. I'm going to direct two questions to Gore, the first of which is, what of your policy recommendations from your recent report do you believe should be prioritized in the short term to have the greatest impact on survivors' lives? And then we have a question from the chat directed at you as well. Has there been any recent progress on the implementation of the urgent interim reparations laws? Is the Ministry of Social Policy consulting on this? And how will the survivor co-designated pilot project by GSF be taken into account? You have the floor.
So I will start with a GSF pilot project and the consultations with victims groups or survivors groups. So recently we attended a conference, and distinguished Ingrid was here as well. And we have heard a lot of criticism to the Ministry of Social Policy after the GSF handed over the project to the Ministry of Social Policy. There was some kind of implementation pause or gap. And we haven't heard, to be honest, publicly, if something changed after the end of November 2025. But as I know, a lot of work in terms of implementation was already done by Global Survivors Fund. So bylaws were already kind of prepared. And the only way to implement that is to actually to start working on that and implementing it by the Ministry of Social Policy together with the social centers in the ground. So as far as I know, the kind of framework is already prepared for that, but I'm not sure if survivors group were kind of consulted on everything. So I think it's a question to the Ministry of Social Policy, and they were kind of reluctant on that. Maybe some insights may have partners who are particularly engaged in this process. And as the second question was about the policy recommendations, and I would say that the most urgent priority is adoption of binding and national-wide instruction or the document or for the investigators and prosecutors which are handling the CRSV cases. And this work was led by the Office of the Prosecutor General together with a PSV expert, Ms. Ingrid Elliott, and the Global Rights Compliance team. During almost 3 years, and now it waits for the approval in the higher level. Why I think this is crucial and the most urgent priority is because we all talk about avoiding a re-traumatization and having a holistic approach. And so at present, survivors of CRSV in Ukraine, their experience varied dramatically depending on geography and individual officials with whom they are engaged first. I recall a case in which survivor following the occupation of Kherson region was approached by investigator and asked whether she had experienced or witnessed violations, and she confirmed that she had and left her contact details. Sometime later, an investigator contacted her and summoned her to the testimony. And I use this word deliberately because that's how she was feeling this interaction. Survivor later described that the conversation was distressing for her. And she felt as so she was being accused of something rather than supported. And she told the investigator that she could not speak at the moment, and yet she confirmed to receive several follow-up calls framed in the way, we need to talk to you. And eventually she explicitly refused to have a calls. And then this case was overseen by the prosecutor from the Office of the Prosecutor General CRSV unit. At that point, we still had this unit. Now it's a bit restructured, which to my knowledge is not the best thing which happened in Office of the Prosecutor General. And she initially, when the prosecutor approached the survivor, she initially declined any communication. And at that point, the prosecutor changed the approach and proposed psychological support through a partner organization. And as well, the medical support was proposed. And nearly after the year of the initial contact from initial contact from the investigator and the following the support she received, survivor felt ready to testify, and she herself reached out to the prosecutor and stated that she was ready to speak. In this case, the investigator was working at the local level and the prosecutor was working at the central level. With this example, like it's not about assigning blame or assessing who performed their role better. Rather, this highlights the critical importance of consistent procedures and specialized knowledge and training, particularly for those officials who are new in CRSV cases and may not have previously worked in these cases. We have seen that frontline professionals, they often lack training to identify CRSV. And when survivors have not disclosed it directly. In fact, many survivors may they will be feeling more comfortable sharing that they have been tortured, are suffering reproductive harm, or they have like long-term health consequences, but might not be ready to discuss the sexual violence committed against them. And untrained prosecutor or the prosecutor who doesn't have any guidance, they will fail to recognize those red flags and that CRSV might occur, and those who do not ask the right questions to the survivors are risk to misqualify or inadequately documenting CRSV cases. So when this happens, CRSV survivors might not receive like treatments and other CRSV specific services, might not receive the reparations we were talking about and the recognition. So despite of the years of work which Ukrainian prosecutors and international partners were doing, there is still no mandatory like standardized document which governing survivor-centered approach of interviewing victims, of evidence collection, of confidentiality and the referral pathways. So this makes investigation and prosecution of CRSV inconsistent, and it weakens the pretrial investigation with a higher risk of having survivors withdrawing their complaint or who prefers to stop participating in the process since they have been victimized by prosecutors and investigators. So I think this is an urgent priority, and it's hopefully will be signed soon. So the main goal of the work of all partners of not avoid re-traumatization at least will be settled.
Thank you so much for that very informative answer. And I'm going to direct the next question to Ingvild, sort of also following this procedural administrative figuring out of how these processes work and uniformizing them. How is research on children born of war done in Ukraine when the war is not yet over and it is not yet peacetime? Is there a mechanism to hold accountable members of the military who raped the women?
So I was going to ask that starting with another part and then moving on to that question, but I will start with this one. Of course, it was very closely linked to what also has been said by Romana and Hoar. So the question, I think what we need to discuss here is also what is it that, well, why do we do it? What is the reason? Why should the women disclose sexual violence, or that they may be pregnant, or that they have maybe even given birth to a child born of war? And one of the things that we've experienced in the Ukraine is that what I also said in my short remarks is that they do not exactly know yet what is there a benefit of disclosing it at all? And so we've been working with Ukrainian local authorities both since 2014, and we've been trying to reach out very quickly in 2022 when the full-scale invasion started to say, don't forget the children born of war. Trying to get an awareness building, trying to get it, even if the women may not want to disclose, at least get the topic on the agenda in a war zone by reaching out both through the OHCHR project, where we did this policy brief, but also through the Children Born of War project, where we also went out to the media, for example, in Norway and Germany, because they are not only in Ukraine. Many of them flew to Poland and to Germany and to the Netherlands and other countries. So actually, this is when we talk about the children born of war and collecting data and information on the children born of war in an ongoing war zone, it's actually not only the war zone per se, because we know that there are also women with children born of war in the neighboring European countries. What we try to do so doing research, maybe one step back. In order to do research, you need to know something. In a crisis situation, it's totally different. You need the information from frontliners. You need the information of what Romana is collecting and doing. You need the access to all actors that could provide relevant information, also secondhand. I am a very big supporter of the Murad Code in this context because it is very much focusing on providing and getting data and documentation as much as you can secondhand without having to address the survivors always directly, because they are repeatedly interviewed. They are repeatedly exposed to the documenting, and then for the reparations, then for the prosecutor, and finding ways of coordinating this information and maybe not re-interviewing all the time, I think would be one of the mechanisms. In this context is where we would usually get to know about a child born of war. So we don't do research yet. What we do is getting in contact with the people, local authorities and organizations on the field. We've done webinars with, amongst others, in the oblast. I have a pronunciation problem. Sorry, Prosha. Probably maybe you recognize the in the Eastern Territories. And because the local authorities, they reached out to us, the Unity for Future Ukraine, and asked, can you help us? We know the local authorities, the organizations, they struggle with what to do with not just the women, but also with the children and the pregnancies. And this is, of course, the first basis we have in order to say we get data, we get information, which we could use research at one point. So research is not the goal in an ongoing conflict. It is getting as much reliable information as possible, which I always say can then be used as information, because what we've learned from previous conflicts is that if we don't reach out, if we don't try to at least document everything possible, it's not just lost for prosecution, and it's also lost for research for always. So finding this balance, I don't know if it answers the question or if it's easy to follow for the online who asked, but this is the way we have been approaching in Ukraine, but also in other ongoing zones where we are asked to give information. So I think a close cooperation between also what you're doing, Romana, and the documentation, but of course we also work with GSF and everybody who's basically in the field, is the best way of getting as a consolidated database as possible on which we can build research if we manage to work across silos. But that's a challenge. Actually. So there are ways, but there's not one size It's not one way.
Well, thank you for all that and, attempting to answer a question which is sort of difficult to answer with both practical impracticalities and the way it's all going in the war. I'm going to address a final question to Emily before I give us all a second to wrap up. I could continue this conversation on forever, but I don't want to leave the audience members hanging on a meeting for too long. Emily, as a general question, how can sexual violence in conflict be prevented?
Thank you, Susanna. I will answer this, but just to quickly follow up on the children born of war question, I have spoken with Ukrainian colleagues and organizations as well, like Unity for Ukraine, who are working in the temporarily occupied territories and who have seen instances of children born of war. But at the moment, in the midst of conflict, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult. Um, Also, children born of war is not a topic that people talk about in Ukraine. Sexual and gender-based violence as a whole is not a topic that is widely spoken about, perhaps outside of the big cities of Kyiv and Lviv. This is what I hear from my Ukrainian colleagues, but it is something that these children will grow up. A lot of them, it's been since 2014, so they're teenagers. And these children will grow up with a stigma surrounding them. And that's why it's so important to raise the awareness now. And the work that Ingvild has been doing with her organization is instrumental to this, and not just bringing it to the attention within Ukraine, but also to other countries and Ukraine's allies. Because as Ingvild has said, this is happening in so many conflicts around the world as well. But back to prevention, which is, I think, if we knew the answer, the world would be a far better place. Prevention, I think, is probably the weakest it's ever been with the unfortunate geopolitics of today and the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, especially in our own country as well. So I think it's incredibly short-sighted to not be investing in prevention and to not be thinking about prevention when we're talking about conflicts and atrocities, because for every $1 invested in conflict prevention, between $26 and $103 is saved in possible conflict-related costs. And then separately, the World Bank has estimated that gender-based violence writ large drains up to 3.7% of the GDP in some countries. Globally, the cost of inaction on gender-based violence is an estimated 1.5 trillion US dollars every year. And yet, in the US, the aid cuts have been deadly. Trump has gotten rid of USAID, which did an immense amount of prevention work in terms of education and providing water and health and sanitation, women's rights, so much more. The offices in the State Department, which used to work on atrocity prevention, are gone. The Office of Global Women's Issues, Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Global Criminal Justice, all of the capacity, all of the brain power, and the incredible people working on these things are gone. The UK, where I'm based, has also been quietly cutting their foreign aid in half. They have rolled back rhetoric and promises related to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, of which prevention is one of the core pillars. And if you look at the UK's most recent National Defence Review and National Security Strategy, Women, Peace and Security is not mentioned once, whereas in the past it has been mentioned and prioritized. It's all about militarization and hard national security interests and threats to the national homeland. So this is not a good sign when two of Ukraine's biggest allies are deprioritizing issues like gender equality, like women, peace and security, like gender-based violence. But the research shows that there is a significant link between the security of women and the security of states. Higher levels of gender inequality equals higher levels of domestic and international instability. So a reframing of what constitutes security and getting out of that binary hard and soft security, which is incredibly gendered, is needed and necessary in order to prevent atrocity crimes, including conflict-related sexual violence. A lot of conversations from the beginning with Ukraine were surrounding accountability and international legal justice and individual criminal responsibility. But we have to remember that accountability isn't necessarily prevention. Accountability is after the fact. And these types of legal routes, while very important, they take years, they're very expensive, they're only available to a select few victims. So it's really important to focus on and invest in prevention so we don't even have to get to that problem in the later term. And that means investing in civil society. That means supporting women-led organizations, supporting gender equality and human rights, and making sure that these things don't backslide. And doing all of these things before a conflict breaks out, because having strong civil society, having press freedom, having gender equality, these all come together to build strong societies that are more able to resist violent conflict and resist authoritarianism, and thus, by extension, everything that comes along with that, which includes conflict and sexual violence and conflict.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you to everyone who joined this panel. Everything you guys have said has been so insightful and instructive for going forward in policymaking. I would like to turn it back to the panelists each for brief closing remarks and any plugs on where audience members might be able to find your ongoing research or work, where they can connect with you if they have any further questions. And after that, we will wrap up. But thank you all again so much for joining us. And thank you to the audience members as well for your questions. Want to just go from the top, Romana, and then we'll go Gore, Inville, and Emily.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and to all the speakers. And just generally, thank you for the opportunity to present our findings and our work. All our reports can be found on the official website of UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. You can find all periodic reports starting from 2014, as well as thematic reports. We have 2 thematic reports on prisoners of war, as well as a recent thematic report on civilian detainees. And all of these reports have information on conflict-related sexual violence. Yes, thank you again very much. A lot of very useful practical insights, and just to say thank you so much to all of you for your work and for raising awareness of this on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you for organizing this event. I really enjoyed the conversation. I liked that we are still talking about things despite of the challenges which Emily framed very, very clearly. And I hope we're gonna continue despite of all these challenges and gaps. So my report, which I prepared for the New Lines Institute, can be found in the New Lines Institute website, as well as in my LinkedIn page. Thank you everyone once again, and thank you to the attendants, and I see some familiar faces here, which is very nice to see. That was a great opportunity to talk to colleagues.
Ingvild, you can go next.
Okay. Well, so thank you also from my side. It's been really interesting. I learned a lot. Closing remark, I would just like to emphasize again what I said before, that the children born of war are one group that has been overlooked for a very long time. We have found ways of getting it on the agenda. We have found ways of addressing this topic of the group, even though we have the challenges in the documentation and the data collection. But it is so fundamental, not just only to the children born of war, but also to keep our eyes open for similar groups that are very likely to exist, that are going still below the radar. So I would encourage basically everyone just to keep as possible in the all work that we're doing, to keep our eyes open and be sure that we do justice to all victim groups or survivors groups or possible victims group, and not just get into a specific tunnel site.
I just want to say thank you to Susanna for moderating, and for all of the panelists. Again, it's been great hearing everyone speak and to see friends again, on the panel and in the audience as well. And you can see the report that I wrote with Ingvild on children born of war on the New Lines website, and the report I wrote on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine, lessons from Bosnia, also on the New Lines website. And yeah, I just highly encourage you to also check out the organizations that the other panelists are affiliated with, the Children Born of War Project, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and all of Gore's work and her past work with the Global Rights Compliance. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you all again. Yeah, it's obviously we could have gone on forever. I'm glad we have so many working professionals who are engaged in the subject matter, all different types that want to work together and want to continue discussing options and ways forwards and ways to improve things. So that is, despite a really, depressing subject matter and state of the world, at least there's people here trying to make changes. So with that, I think it's appropriate to wrap up. Thank you all again, and please follow along everyone's work on their websites, on their LinkedIns, and have a good rest of your day, whatever time zone you're in right now.